and thank you for joining in our summit today. You are in a presentation entitled Engaging Men and Boys in Sexual Violence Prevention, Past, Present, and Future. And I am tickled pink, and I meant that pun was intended to be the moderator for this final session for a day that has been really profoundly powerful, spiritually uplifting. I'm excited because my brothers are here, Terence and Dave and Marc, and we're celebrating 10 years on a project. It's been 10 years when we engaged in this work, and that is the reason why this is so near and dear to my heart, is the fact that when the idea was presented to engage men and boys in sexual violence, is when I first started working at NCCASA, right? Because I will celebrate in March 11 years. So I hadn't been there that long when we started doing that work. And it was Monica who said, wow, that would be a great idea. And then she just took it, they took it and ran with it and made it bigger and better than we ever thought we'd see. And so I'm excited about that. And I'm not going to be before you long, as my pastor always says, and then preach it for another 45 minutes. But anyway, I'm going to introduce y'all to Nakisha Floyd. Nakisha has served on our Sexual Violence Prevention Advisory Council for almost the whole time that I had been working with NCCASA. When I first started doing the prevention work, Nakisha served on the Sexual Violence Prevention Advisory Council. Nakisha has a storied career in doing public health work, and now is working at Poe Health Educational Center. But I think the reason why we nabbed her is some of the work that she is doing with her PhD. And so Nakisha, I'm going to turn it over to you as you introduce yourself, because we want to put that information in the chat, because that directly relates to this conversation we're going to have today. So Nakisha, take it away, my friend.
Okay. Good afternoon. I'm so happy to be here today with you all. Again, my name is Nakisha Floyd, and yes, I have worked on the Sexual Violence Prevention Task Force, but I am currently finishing my dissertation study on Black men and masculinity and manhood. And so that's kind of how I have come into being today's facilitator for the discussion. And I'm so excited because we have an amazing panel of men joining us today. And our panel members, Tony Porter, Marc, Grimmett, Terence Leathers, and Alpha Arnett, actively work to prevent sexual violence and social injustices. And so over the next hour, we plan to have an engaging and very informative discussion about the role of men and boys in ending sexual violence and social injustices in our society. And so before we begin our conversation, let's have an introduction of today's panel members. And so to our panelists, if each of you could provide your name, as well as a sentence or two about the work that you're doing, and then that will jumpstart us into our conversation. And starting with Tony.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm with an organization named A Call to Men, and our work is around promoting healthy, respectful, responsible manhood. We work primarily with men who would be defined not as violent. I say that loosely, it's a real thin line. We know that to be the majority of men, and that they're very instrumental to the solution. We believe that if women could end the violence on their own, they would have already. And that, so when we're talking about preventing the violence, that men, male identified folks have a critical role to play in that. And so that's the work we do on a national level as well as globally, as well as internationally. We're in those spaces as well. And National Coalition Against Sexual Assault has been a partner of ours for many, 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 many years. Those sisters over there do fantastic work, and we always love to be in their presence. So thank you for having us.
All right. Should I go?
Yes, go ahead.
I'm sorry. My name is Terence Leathers, and I currently serve as pastor of Mount Vernon Christian Church in Clayton, North Carolina. I've been in the ministry for close to 30 years now, and I've always been involved in youth issues. I worked at the Mayor's Turning Points program in Washington, D.C. for Marion Barry a long time ago, dealing with prevention and youth services and all of those kinds of things. So it's been near and dear to me. About 10 years ago, I became involved with this work and met people like Tony Porter and Alpha Arnett and others, and it has been a great work for us. And when we did, we had a rites of passage program, but it centered itself on sexual violence prevention. And we did several classes of that. And to this day, people still talk about it. In fact, we have persons, Dave and Tony, you may not know of, who've gone on to do great heights as being because they were a part of that particular program. So that's a little bit about me, and hopefully as we go through this process, we can share some other things.
Brother Alpha, I think you're muted. You're trying to check in.
I was simply trying to determine whether or not you all could read my lips is why. Gosh, I'm not sure how I muted that, but I am Alpha David Arnett. If you hear someone refer to me as Dave, that is, for lack of a better term, my middle name, if you will. So I, again, am glad to be with you at such a time as this. Currently, I am on the staff of the Greater Mount Sinai Baptist Church here in Charlotte, North Carolina. In addition to being a part of that staff, I have continued, as Terence Leathers mentioned a bit earlier, we connected with NCCASA about 10 years ago around creating this curriculum. And what I will say as it relates to this curriculum is that it has really stayed with me for 10 years because as we were developing a rites of passage curriculum, initially it started off with infusing into that curriculum some things that would ensure that we were helping to advance the cause of preventing sexual violence and domestic assault and prevention. But as we developed it and over the years, it has become clear to me that when we look at what some of these root causes are of sexual assault and rape and that kind, when we look at some of those root causes, then it's just hard to separate that from what we do to develop men and young men into having some sense of identity and meaning and self-worth in terms of who they are. And so you don't even separate that. So for me, it was really eye-opening to see how more than just developing a curriculum, it has really influenced not only how I live and how I do, but every aspect of how I deal with my friends and peers, and certainly all the youngsters that I continue to work with is absolutely influenced by that, because it's not to be compartmentalized, rather, it's all related. So glad to be here today.
You, Brother Alpha. My name is Marc Grimmett. I am a licensed psychologist and a professor of counselor education at NC State, where I direct the Community Counseling, Education, and Research Center. And I came into this work in a personal and professional way. First, I want to thank NCCASA again for the opportunity to be here. But my first exposure to this type of work dealing with sexual violence was just through women in my life who shared that they had experienced this. And secondly, after I became a mental health professional, I worked with several and continue to work with several survivors and many survivors of sexual violence. And so I wanted to move more toward the prevention side, particularly engaging men and boys in preventing sexual violence. And that opportunity really came with this grant from the North Carolina Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Did we lose our host?
Well, you know
I am
what?
not sure. It looks like we may have dropped Nakisha for some reason, so she may be calling in just a moment, but I actually have her notes and know that I kind of want to start by just throwing out to you for some discussion. What is something that you think we can do to engage men and boys in ending sexual violence? And if each of you wants to maybe share some of that.
Well, I'll start. I think one of the most important things is it flows from self, right? For me, as we can teach boys as well as men, there's no question about it, it's a bottom-up, top-down experience. We could teach boys to be their authentic selves. They will no longer have the desire to distance themselves from the experience of women and girls to define what it means to be a man. And once we are no longer distancing ourselves, we start to develop a authentic interest in the experience of women and girls, because what we teach boys is to define what it means to be a man by distancing themselves, and to effectively distance themselves, they're taught to have a lack of interest. We want to develop a generation of boys where they have an interest, male identified folks where they have an interest in the experience of girls outside of sexual conquest. We want to embrace humanity. In order to do that, we got to teach boys to be their authentic selves. Once we can really embrace that and move about our business, normalizing that, I think it makes it much easier for boys then to have common interests with girls. And then we are creating a society of men who are going to promote equity, who are going to promote equality, who are going to stand on the front lines alongside of our sisters. But I believe it starts with teaching boys to be their authentic selves, to get out of what we call the man box, right? To start breaking down those barriers. Once we start doing that, then we're not only on a road for them being healthy themselves, but we're also on the road to preventing all forms of violence against women and girls.
I think that's so true, and I need to say something to Tony, especially. He brought up the concept of the man box, and that's so critical and so important as he shares with us what's on his mind and how men and boys can be engaging to each other, but also how they engage themselves into society. I think one of the things that's so critical is that we must really become, when I say we, specifically men, but we have to become a part of our community. And that community that we have must be not only that community around us, but the faith community, the the recreational community, whether it includes sports, whatever it is, all of those kinds of things. We've got to have something that says that we are extending ourselves and we want to be a part of something. It's hard to go up and say something to a child or to a young man and you're not engaged with that person, or you have not encountered that person in a significant way. Because then you go up to someone with an authoritarian kind of notion, and it's not credible. So I think that's a critical aspect. And I think when Dave and I did the program together, and Tony also participated in that process, one of the things that I saw was that engagement. And once you become engaged, it's important then to get an education about who you are, because it's hard to express to boys those kinds of things that they should and ought do and be aware of, and you yourself are not aware of those kinds of things. So I think it's important to be open to learning, because to do this kind of work is ever changing, but there's certain things that remain the same, but you got to be open to the prospect of learning and engaging. So a part of what I believe in is that's so important. And then once you do that, once you engage, once you become involved with a child or a boy or a man, and then you're open to learning, then you begin the process of sharing, no matter how much you've learned, no matter how little it is. And then you begin the process of having conversations with those individuals that you encounter, those individuals in your immediate group, and then those individuals in society.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Did anybody else have anything you wanted to add to that first question?
I would just very quickly say that I initially would have said that, we need to talk more. We're sort of taught that men, action, all about action.
Right.
And we need to talk more, but I would expand that and say, particularly with the onset of social media now, we need to communicate more. And so what I mean by that is that one of the ways that we can effect some change is that I just remember when I grew up, for instance, my dad did not talk to us a lot about what we needed to do. In fact, he was in charge of discipline. And so basically he didn't talk to us about, you need to do this, you need to do it. Mom did all of the training and the teaching in terms of that. And really his role was, what my mother would do is say, John, and she would call his name. By the time she called his name, he would come in and discipline us. And the only thing that he would say to us is, didn't I tell you, do what your mama said do? I say that to say, many times he did not even know what we had done, what law we had broken, he didn't even know that. But he knew when my mom called him that meant it was time for him to come in. And I share that to say that we have to talk to each other more and communicate with each other more and be a more integral part of how we do what we do, and not just assume, that our sisters or women, if you are the ones who teach and socialize, and then the men just go out and provide and protect. There has to be more communication in order for us to be able to address that issue.
I know one of the things Nakisha shared with me that she was finding in her doctoral research was that for some of the men she interviewed, there seemed to be interesting things about the way they defined the difference, if they saw one, between masculinity and manhood. And they had shared some of their personal reflections with her. But I know, Marc, maybe we can let you start us off. Is that something that you find that distinction useful? And if so, how do y'all understand that in your lives?
Thank you for the question, Chris, and the opportunity to share. I try to think back to how I behaved, as a boy and what was important to me. So being tough and being strong, not being perceived as weak, those were implicit and explicit messages that I received. And I wanted to kind of portray that I could handle myself and demonstrate that when necessary. And, now with being older, having more education, more experiences, and quite honestly, being able to listen to the girls and women in my life, I realized that I had unintentionally placed a lot of limitations on being a full human being, like Tony was saying. So, you know, men and boys have feelings. You know, we get hurt, we can be sad, and without having the opportunity to kind of live that full range of experiences and emotions, it can cause a lot of problems. So I'll just say, going into manhood or looking back at my life and looking on my life now, having two boys, ages 8 and 11, I kind of compare myself to them. And what I notice is they don't quite have the edge that I had or have, you know, growing up. And I think that's a good thing. And one basic example is my 11-year-old. He's in 6th grade. He's in this text message group, and his mom showed me. We try to have it, you know, maintain his privacy and stuff, but it popped up, and he's in a text group, and it's the name of the group is 6th grade girlies and Harper. So I count that as a success, like a parenting success, that our son is comfortable being in a group with 24 girls and being the only boy in it and identifying as a boy. And one other example I'll give you all is that Harper's also in this little gaming club. They try to create video games. And again, it's led by girls. You know, the girls are the leaders of this group, and they are having a hard time kind of scheduling meetings. And Harper is a pretty good organizer. And he's like, Mom, I want to help them organize our meetings better, but I don't want to impose myself as one of the boys in the group. So again, these are things that I might not have thought about at his age, but because of the lessons I've learned, and my partner and I are trying to teach him, my partner who's a woman, about listening to girls and power and oppression, they're starting to take root in a way in his boyhood that really didn't take root in me until I was much later in life.
Thanks, Marc. That was really some profound stuff that he understands and he sees in society, that men have usually have a tendency to take up a lot of space. And he recognized that in society, and he understood how to fall back and to ask if I am. And asking, this is a piece that I think is really powerful. He asked another female identified person instead of you, right? Should he do that? Was another piece that is really, really something that we can't walk away without acknowledging. That I'm happy to report that Nakisha, of course, I don't know how many times I've been on a Zoom call and they can't hear you. Your screen went blank and you're trying to figure it out. She lost her internet, but she's on the phone, and I'm going to turn it back over to her. Thank you, Chris, for standing in the gap.
Yes, thank you. Thank you both so much. And I apologize. We went through this technology, and I checked yesterday, and lo and behold, we get right into the conversation and the internet decides to go out, and I don't know why. But so please forgive me. But going to the next question, and I want to address this question to Terence. However, anyone feel free to jump in as things bubble up. How do we support boys and men in the process of healing from or coping with their traumas? And then 2, how might that change our culture overall?
I think you have to be real with yourself about where you are and the traumas and the situations that you may have had. And I'll give you quick piece and kind of relates to what we were talking about a minute ago, but I promise to make sure I'm including what you've asked of me. I thought that when my wife passed away, I had to be the strongest person ever. I had to ensure that my daughter saw me as being strong and that I could carry on everything. I didn't want to cry. I didn't want to break down. I didn't want to. There was that I guess that mythology of me taking care of everything and making sure everything was in place. And to finally got to the point where it wasn't really good for me, and I wasn't. There was something missing. And one time, I was able to. My daughter was in her room, and I came into the room. I noticed she was crying, and I was trying to, I guess, stop the crying initially, but then something told me to get into bed and cry with her. Mm. So one of the things that I think that's so important is that I had to feel that and I had to understand that. And one of the things that we have to do when our boys and others are maybe going through traumas in various situations, sometimes we have to sit with them. And I don't think you have to say everything at that particular moment in time. I think it's critical to be with the person, to perhaps get to know the person, but to sit with them in their struggle, to sit with them in their issue, to sit with them in their pain. Because when you sit with them in it, they're not alone. But then you develop, hopefully, a bond with them that then can allow you to help take them where they can begin to vent and move to another side of life. And that may, and whether they've been hurt physically, you got to be careful how you do that. Whether they've been abused, of course, you got to be careful, and you got to make sure that you're not adding to the situation. But you got to be in the moment with them in order to take them through and show them how they can get through the other moments that they will have. And so that's, I hope I addressed one aspect of the question. But what was the second aspect of it? I'm getting older now.
Oh, no problem, because it was definitely a two-part question. And so how might that support that we provide ultimately change our culture overall?
I think if we are seen as a person who will provide support, provide encouragement, provide an attitude that say that I'm going to stay with you, then through this process, I think that can impact them. I think they can learn from that and hopefully take what they have learned, take what they've gone through and say, listen, I went through this process. Someone supported me. Someone gave me a sense of personhood. Someone gave me a broad identity. Then that's perhaps what I can and ought do. I think, well, whatever we do, it should be with the mentality of not only moving us, but specifically that individual to another level, but thinking about the larger aspect of what society says. We are our best examples, and we are the ones that can make a change, and we have to be in that process to do that so that others can learn and hopefully multiply that and let that grow.
Thank you.
Can I get in there for a second? I want to tap on, I want to join on what Terence my brother is sharing there.
Absolutely, absolutely.
This is real important to me as well. Before doing the work of A Call to Men, I was a social worker. I was a director of addiction services in a hospital in New York. And look, I can't tell you the number of times, well, when you talk about sexual violence, right? We're talking about trauma. And you know, as we know, 1 out of 4 women are sexually assaulted. Well, 1 out of 6 men are sexually assaulted. I mean, the difference is with women, you know, it's clearly tied. Well, I ain't going to go that deep, but it's definitely tied to a male-dominating society. Is tied to the objectification of women, less value, women property of men, etc. But doesn't change the fact of what happened to men as well. I mean, with women, it happens across their lifetime, maybe with a concentration, you know, in 16 to 20 some odd years old, but still across a lifespan, it can happen. I mean, we've seen women 80 years old in nursing homes who were sexually assaulted. I think the difference with boys is just most of it, not all, but a lot of it is concentrated from about 0 to 18. But, you know, while I was working as an addiction specialist, I can't tell you the countless number of men who would come into treatment around 40 years old, and it'd be the first time that they ever shared what happened to them when they were 8. So like a whole generation, 30 years or so would go by. They never shared the sexual violence that happened to them at 8 years old. And so much of that has to do with what we're taught that it means to be a man, right? That they're supposed to handle it. They're not supposed to share their feelings. They're not supposed to share their emotion. They're not supposed to ask for help. Men not supposed to offer help. Men not supposed to, you know, accept help. Handle your business, right? And so men would walk around with that trauma for generation. You know, some men take it to their deathbeds and never, and based on how we define manhood in regards to, especially with boys that it happened to twice, and perpetrators in their ear, you know, challenging what we would call his manhood, as, you know, as if he wanted this. Just, I can't tell you, you know, the number of men that would finally share that. And the thing about it is, because we know trauma breeds trauma, so a whole generation, 30 years, holding on to that, they've been wreaking havoc in everybody's life that's vulnerable to them, because hurt people hurt people. You know, wreaking havoc in everyone's lives who's vulnerable to them. And so much of it is rooted in their inability to talk about what's going on with them. You know, we teach boys quickly, early on. You ask a 16-year-old boy who's looking a little twisted up, John, what's wrong? He's gonna say nothing. John, how you doing? I'm good. And so much of that is rooted in a male dominating society, and what we teach boys that it means to be a man. So we can teach boys to share their feelings and emotions when they're hurting and not feeling good, to say I'm hurting and I'm not feeling good. You know, we can begin to model that as men as well, and teach it to boys, teach boys to talk. We have such limited emotional intelligence as men, right? We you know, and we got to challenge that. We got to change that in our society, I believe. And so the story that Terence is sharing about with his daughter when his wife passed, that's the kind of stuff we gotta change that as men.
Nakisha, we do have a couple of questions in the chat. Just let me know when you're ready for those.
Okay, thank you. And what was just shared was so powerful, and I would really like to unpack that just a little bit if we can. So one thing that you brought up was that the messages that are taught in society about being a man and being masculine and not being vulnerable by sharing feelings. I've had the opportunity to talk to some men in my life, and one of the things that comes up is that they just don't feel like there are safe spaces for them to be vulnerable and to truly express their feelings. And so I want to know, how can we provide safe spaces? What can we do to create a safe space for men to start to open up and to feel supported and comfortable in being able to express their emotions?
Are you asking that to someone in particular?
Yes, because I can't see who was talking
I
last.
think
Who was
Dave.
sharing.
So
Dave
ready
yes.
to
I'll jump in after Brother Dave.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I think in terms of, first of all, it is certainly important to be able to create those safe spaces, and it calls, and I'm really following up on what some of the other brothers have said. It calls for us to redefine strength, if you will, and to say, so many times for boys and men, strength has this sort of a physical definition, if you will, in terms of how we carry ourselves. And you're strong based on you're gonna respect me, and so we look at those signs and symbols of strength. So I think we have to even redefine and say the real strength, for instance, is to be able to recognize that what I need to do right now is to cry with my daughter, and we have to redefine that, because again, when I was a kid, hey, if a man cried, that was considered weak, period, point blank, end of story. When I was coming up in the 60s and 70s, there was no discussion, there was no any of that. If a man was crying or in any way even sharing or showing some emotion besides anger, if emotion for the most part besides anger was being shown, then it was considered a sign of weakness. And so I think we have to redefine. And I think about, for instance, many men attend churches, for instance. And one of the things that we did, even in terms of the church in DC, where I was a member, as well as our church here, one of the things that we did was created these groups of men and created safe spaces. Even we didn't necessarily have professional therapists and professional counselors, but we created a space where we sat in a circle and we made the commitment that what goes on in this circle and what we talk about in this physical circle does not leave this circle. Terence and I did the exact same thing when we did the program with the youngsters. We made it clear that this is a circle that you can be honest, that you can be emotional, that you can be vulnerable. And we even led by example, if you will, as the men in the program began to share. And there was some deep sharing. And so we came thinking that we are here to teach these boys to do what they need to do, when the reality is it was therapeutic for many of us. So I think, again, it is that redefinition, but also creating those opportunities of having trusted relationships with men whereby we can share with each other. And then the final thing I'll say connected to that is, but also when we determine, in some cases, you need professional help. There's a need for some professional therapy and counseling. And so even if you have these groups, there ought to be at least one person, whether it's the pastor, whoever in that group, that has some sense of being able to make some referrals and some connections, such to the point that those things that have come out, whereby there may be some professional kind of attention that will help get that person to the other side.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
And so,
oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, Natasha.
No, go ahead.
Well, similar to what Brother Alpha just said, I just want to add to it, because he talked about the conditions that are necessary for men to open up and to be honest and to get into our feelings. And a couple things he talked about, modeling that, you know, as the facilitators or as the leaders, we have to model it. We have to live that ourselves. And in order to do it, that requires us to do some work on ourselves, most of us. So, you know, showing feelings, particularly with boys and with other men, is important. So my kids and my students, my graduate students, they've all seen me cry before in class. Doesn't make me less of a person or less of a man. It actually makes me a full, complete human. I just got through crying watching the inauguration, and my little one came up, you know, looking at me, but it's not unusual to them. So I think that's similar to what Brother Alpha was saying. The other part is just having some understanding that you referenced earlier, is that in order for us to develop deep, meaningful, honest connections, we have to make ourselves vulnerable. And to make ourselves vulnerable necessarily puts you at risk And to go back to what Tony and Dr. Leathers were saying before, some people may have already experienced a traumatic event, you know, when they were vulnerable or were made to be vulnerable. So that's a lot to ask of someone when you don't know their history. And even if you know that, that's a whole lot to ask. So it's incumbent on us who are trying to develop connections with men, Black men, any men, to really demonstrate that we're trustworthy and we're not going to hurt them. So you can't just say that, you know, it's good to explicitly state it, but you have to demonstrate it, and that happens over time. It's a real
Yeah. I think it's necessary for us as men, particularly male identified folks, particularly doing this work, to operate the work out, the work backwards, right? And just the statement, creating a safe space. I think we have to have an understanding of the word safe. Why are we using that word safe? Why is safe? For me, safe is the operative word. And so then what is unsafe, and why is it unsafe? Why is it unsafe to be vulnerable, right? Why, Brother Arnett was talking about church, right? Why is it okay in the sanctuary for me to praise the Lord, cry, let it all hang out, and then I get in the fellowship hall, which is usually right across the hall, and I got to buck up, you know? What is that about? What is that about? For the fellowship hall, we could get in there as men, the same men that were crying in the sanctuary. We go across the hall of the fellowship hall, we might as well be in a bar, right? What is that about for us as men? The whole issue of safety, right? This whole issue of safety, what's safe and what's not safe, right? And because the real deal at the end of the day is we want to, you know, what we really want to normalize is a cultural shift or environment where I don't have to worry about safety to be authentic, right? I don't have to be concerned about safety to be vulnerable, which is part of being authentic, right? We're not at that point yet, though. And so men are going to worry about safety. So I think it's incumbent upon us to really kind of work backwards and understanding those of us who are engaging men, as Brother Marc was just sharing, what's going on with men in our society that we got to provide safety in order for them to be authentic. That's what we're talking about in my estimation. Be authentic, we need to provide safety. So in other words, what we're saying, that as men in general, we're not our whole self, we're a role self. We're always front, you know, we're always being something we're not, because it's not safe. And even when I hear myself say it out loud, it's kind of crazy, but it's real. It's not safe. It's not safe to be who I am, you know? So I have to be this role self. I got to just do tradition all the time, you know, and then I got to find these pockets where I can be my authentic self. I think really understanding and challenging the work from that perspective is real important for men like ourselves that are facilitating.
It's really powerful to hear that, because then it really hones in on that, the statement that patriarchy is really harmful to everyone. So, you know, when you say about the societal messages that you learned, they've been based in patriarchy, but they've been harmful, right? And so that kind of goes into our last question for today, is how do men and boys go about unlearning the societal messages that foster toxic masculinity so we can be replaced with a more positive form of masculinity? And that's to anyone on the panel.
I mean, I'll jump in. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
All right. I think, you know, unlearning is a tough thing, and I'm not, and but I get the principle. I feel like I don't know if we can unlearn stuff we've learned, but we can learn better, and it can kind of and we can choose which path we want to follow. And I think that's been my experience. And what helps is but you can't learn something if you're not exposed to it at all. And so I benefited from being exposed to both men and women and non-binary folks, and taking in their experiences of that were different from mine, and wanting and really not liking having to be so tough all the time, you know. But I didn't know I didn't like it until someone said, look, you really don't have to be this way all the time, and exposed me to something else. So I just want to offer like one quick example, because related to this work, is that, you know, with NCCASA, we made the documentary My Masculinity Helps. And the idea is like, can we show kids or talk to kids, boys, like briefly, and kind of shift their worldview? And what we found out is like, we can, you know, but most of the time these conversations aren't happening. It's not so difficult, you know, it's just we have to create an opportunity for people to learn. So if I can give you just one example, like we asked these high school boys, like, how did this film affect you? Like, I'm talking about a 30-minute film, you know, we saw like right after, like, what happened? It says it opened my eyes to sexual assault. I never really felt as bad as I should have about rape until now. Shows you should care and be concerned about others, also their feelings and how they take words. It affected me because I never know who had gone through sexual assault. So it's a real eye opener. So the point there is related to your conversation about patriarchy, is like, they're not using the word patriarchy and male domination, but just an opportunity to talk about things and the question stuff that they may not have known or taken for granted can really make a shift. And I'm just offering that now, is that it doesn't have to be this big structured intervention all the time. It can be a short, brief conversation that can start that unlearning process that you talked about and put us on the path.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. And so when we are talking about helping boys and men in society with being open, being able to express their emotions, to think about masculinity in a new way, so they are open to creating a more positive form of it. What are some concrete steps that we can start to take in order to move our society into a better place? And that's for anyone on the panel.
Well, a couple things come to mind. I think one of the things that we have to do is we have to be able to identify and call out this, I'll just use that term to say this toxic masculinity, if you will, to identify and call it what it is. That's I think that's part of some concrete steps, is to call it what it is. But also, even when we look at some of that negative messaging from patriarchy and where it came from and how it issues in our thoughts, and then of course our thoughts turns into behaviors, and behaviors turn into habits. So I think it's first to be able to call it for what it is. We do have the benefit of some academic research and other kinds of statistics and numbers, but also even using examples to help our boys and help ourselves, but even help our boys and men to understand, similar to racism, if you will, that there's some systemic causes, but to begin to look at what some of those systemic causes are of how we got where we are, but also the kind of damage that it has caused. I see sort of the first piece is being able to draw a connection between some of those systemic causes, if you will, and where we are, but also what some of those results are, but how those results, since we're talking about sexual assault, when we begin to talk about power and identity and what it is to be a man in terms of what that definition of power is, then The worst case of that, I think, is that it results in sexual assault. But so many times, there's so many things prior to that. It may never get to what we call sexual assault or rape, but even when we look at this sort of unevenness of this society, so I think again, step one is to be able to call it out. And then I think the other is, as we call it out, to then begin to say, if this, for lack of a better term, if these are some of the problematic kinds of things that have led to us being where we are, it becomes so much easier then to look at how we can then begin, if we use the term messaging, how we can now send some different messages, not only in terms of what we say, but obviously in terms of what we do, to send some other messages that we think are going to yield some better results that would at least, and have to recognize, it's been a long time coming. I think it's important to say that it's not go away overnight, but we start this process of sending different messages, again, number one, by how we behave and carry ourselves, and then by what we challenge each other to do, that peer challenging. When we sitting around with the fellas, with the frat brothers and everything else, when we're sitting around and certain conversations come up, we have a responsibility either to continue with business as usual or to kind of steer things and challenge things in a different direction. So that's just a couple things that I think of, some concrete steps we can take.
Okay, thank you. And so we're going to go to the questions for the few minutes that we have left. So Robin, can you ask some of the questions that are in the chat?
Sure. Are there any programs for fathers to teach them how to be teachers of nonviolence to their sons? Anyone?
So I don't know of many programs that are that specific. I'm not saying they're not out there. I just don't know of many programs that are that specific. But what I do know, just the conversation we're having here right now would clearly meet that goal. So any program, any initiative that's designed to promote healthy manhood, healthy masculinity will meet that goal because we are talking to male identified folks, we're talking to men, we're talking to fathers. You know, I think I can even maybe answer a little bit of that by going back to the previous question. So I appreciate asking the question by unlearning. And I heard my brother Marc, because I hear where he's coming from. But what I like about unlearning and in the question is clearly identifying that is a learned behavior, right? That is socialization, is what we're taught, is not biologically predetermined. So I like unlearning. I appreciate what Marc is sharing, because if you've already learned it, I don't know if you're going to unlearn it. What you're going to do more so is have the ability now to exercise choices. Now there's what we teach, and then what we don't teach, that becomes real important, right? What we're teaching. So as Marc is talking about his son, like with my sons, they were, you know, I had to really focus not so much on learning, but on giving them other choices. Now with my grandson, I'm teaching, right? Because we're talking about from Jump Street, I'm teaching. So as far as fathers are concerned, like it's really about developing a voice, really learn. We're the first generation of men that's ever been asked to really not only end violence or stop violence against women and girls, but also to prevent it, like promoting healthy manhood. So this is new language for men, new experience for men, and fathers are men in many cases, right? We're talking about male identified folks are men. So what we're saying is that we're trying to give men a voice, teach them new language, teach them new ways of being. So everything that we're talking about here would apply to a father, it would apply to a coach, it would apply to a school teacher, it would apply to a faith leader, anyone who's engaging in the lives of boys is what we're talking about in their development to become men. But we do that understanding that we're the first generation of men that's ever been asked to do this. So it's new to us in many respects. So a lot of it is developing of boys. We talk a lot to men about their influence, their platform. If you're a dad, you got a lot of influence. How are you using your influence? What platforms are you creating as a respect to your influence? So it's engaging men, engaging fathers from that perspective. So you don't need a fatherhood program of any sort to do this. This can happen in any initiative that's focused on healthy, respectful manhood.
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to what Marc was saying, that it doesn't have to have structure, doesn't have to have this defined structure. Anytime that you're engaging with men around nonviolence, you created a space in order to have these conversations. Like Tony was saying, this is the first generation, and we're creating these spaces with certain language. And one of the questions, if I go to the next question, is what ideas would you all offer to domestic violence survivors that are single moms with sons? And I want to pose this to Dr. Leathers, because I know firsthand that with him and Dave doing that curriculum, it was important. There was a lot of boys that came with single mothers that were raised by single moms, and they created, as part of the curriculum, the nest. So Dr. Leathers, could you share your idea around creating the need for having the nest? And Dave, feel free to interject as well.
You just gave it away. You just said everything. Think about it. I did. Well, I missed that program. I really do. And there are ways in which I think we can get back to doing some of that. The nest was that whole notion of just taking the community to real child. We had boys, and it's something, you know, Dave and I still, and many times, you know, we keep in contact with a lot of those boys, or those boys contact us. But the notion around it was, whatever we were doing with those boys, we knew that the parents had to also, in many respects, buy into it. And majority of the parents were women. And there were some fathers that were not there. So we knew that we wanted to get them involved in this process so that they could see what was going on, but also they could participate in the process. We wanted them to feel a part of it as well. And so the nest gave them an opportunity to not only help us as it relates to providing refreshments or whatever. Those are the basic pieces, and food and coordinating that effort. But also it gave them an opportunity to see their boys in a different light. Also to interject when possible after we had meetings, or because sometimes we even included them in the process, so that they could feel free to kind of be a part of what the men were about as they were trying to facilitate something with their kids, but also what their boys were about, because they got a chance to see a different aspect of their boys, and they got a chance to see their boys in another stage of development. So that nest, I thought, was so critical. And as you know, what a nest does, a nest protects. A nest has something in it. Also has some nutrients in it. I guess if you can look at an egg or whatever like that, a nest is a place where you can go and feel comfortable in, and kind of lay yourself there and be secure that everything is going to be all right. So you wanted to give those parents that opportunity to feel strengthened by other members in the nest, so that they could also deal with their kids. There was strength in numbers as it came to that particular nest. We also had not only the parents involved in it, but we also had community leaders and businesses involved in it as well, because what's that old saying we said again, it takes a village to raise a child. It took the nest, it takes community people, it takes businesses, it takes sports, it takes all of that. So what we're trying to do is trying to link into a community or help create a community that could help do all of that.
All right. Thank you so much. And so I know that we've come to the end of our conversation for today. And so I really want to thank you all for being so open and honest with your answers